The Honourable Steve Whan.
Come on, Steve.
Mr Deputy President, I rise to support the excellent speech made by our Shadow Minister Sophie Kotsis last night in this place on this legislation, where she put such a strong and cogent case for why the government should not be backing this legislation. Now, I understand that the Shooters and Fishers Party and the Lord Mayor of Sydney probably don't see eye to eye on very much, and indeed there is some areas where I wouldn't see eye to eye with her either. But that doesn't mean that I'd be willing to support legislation which is trying to skew the democratic process and get rid of her by using this Parliament's power rather than the voters' right under a democracy. I do have to say I agree with the Lord Mayor on her efforts to get more cycleways in Sydney, because that is something which is a very positive thing for this city. But there is a couple of points that I wanted to make in this, and they go to some of the comments that have been made here already, and we've had a fair bit of debate about this idea in the legislation of giving businesses 2 votes. Now, for the government to back this is an example of gross hypocrisy when we've seen this government introduce a system where, in abolishing the LHPAs and the CMAs, they replaced the system in that case where landholders had a vote per person who was on the electoral roll in the area, with a situation where each landholder under the LLS only gets a single vote. So even if there is a family of eligible voters in that household, or as is often the case, a husband and a wife in that situation, they have to choose which one of them gets the vote. Now, for the government to come in here and say, well, look, we did that, we've rolled that out, but we're going to be completely inconsistent in the City of Sydney and say that we'll give businesses 2 votes is just frankly hypocritical. And it is something which this government and its members should hang their heads over, because it is an example of them manipulating voting systems to try and give themselves an advantage. And of course, we saw in the case of the LLS. I know that in the gallery here today we have quite a few people who I suspect would have been interested in the LLS votes. And the debacle at that election was as this government overturned the old rolls and put in place only 1 vote per property. It is ridiculous for them in this debate to actually come in and say that they should have 2 votes per business in the area. Now, we saw earlier speakers in this place talking about why this legislation wouldn't apply to rural councils. Now, the fact is the legislation as it stands does allow the government by regulation to roll this out to other councils. And that is a very dangerous situation. We've heard the government itself talk about some of the other bigger city councils which it was talking about. But let's look at what might happen if you rolled this out to a council like the Snowy River Shire, for example, where there are a large number of absentee business landholders in Jindabyne. And if they were all to get 2 votes, you would never see a representative of the rural landholders elected to Snowy River Shire again, because they'd be overwhelmed by the business vote from that single community. So it's a dangerous piece of legislation. It's being put in place because this government has shown us on several occasions that it is willing to use the forums of the Parliament, its numbers in the Parliament, to pass laws to damage its political opponents. This is the second time we've seen this government trying to pass laws to attack the Lord Mayor of Sydney. We've seen this government using its numbers to pass laws which it hoped would damage the structure of the Labor Party, because it was its way of trying to make sure that the Labor Party structures, which have been in place for over 100 years, were damaged by its legislation. So we saw that overturned in the High Court, and the hypocrisy of this government was apparent, where we saw them at exactly the same time as moving legislation to try and damage the Labor Party structures. They were, in their party organisation, rorting the existing electoral laws and taking illegal donations. So what a bunch of hypocrites we have on this side of the chamber. I can only endorse, once again, the great speech made by the Shadow Minister last night, where she even went back and told us the roots of democracy As a Greek descent in this place, telling us about the roots of democracy, I did expect us to tell us about the benefits of Windex as well, but she didn't get to that part of the discussion on the roots of democracy. She did an excellent job, and I fully endorse the Shadow Minister's comments in opposing this legislation.